yeah, I can't go on without you. I'm just stuck in the moment, trying to pursue what it ought to be. So cold, it's like I'm reading letters in bold. So cold, so cold. It's what it ought to be now. Be now. It's what it ought to be. Gee, Loretta, trying to make it with threat. I count my dollars and dollars are worth dollars. So that's the way it something special, something so tight. Fall in love with you, girl. Swap it out with you, girl. Never give up on you, girl. That's the way it ought to be. I say that's the way it ought to be. Ought to be. Ought to be. And even though sometimes we're like a duo, we often see eye to eye and we're a duo. I'm just stating how I feel. Making projects to go to my heel. Doing everything I can. Doing everything I can. Pouring out my heart and soul into these projects. Pouring out my heart and soul into these projects. Yeah. So that's the way it ought to be. So that's the way it ought to be. Yeah, I say that's the way it ought to be. Making love, you shawty show up. On time, and that's the way it ought to be. Yeah, I said that's the way it ought to be. 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 Ought to be, ought to be, oughta. You shawty show up. You shawty show up. You shawty show up. I guess I could fall in love with you, girl. And that's the way it ought to be. The way it ought to be. Way it ought to be. Ought to be, 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 ought to be. The way it ought to be. Yeah. Oh yeah. The way it ought to be. Ought to be, 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 ought to be, hey.